Chapter 26, the seeded plants. As a review from our previous discussions in the last chapter, let's take a look at the evolution of the land plants, starting with the charophytes, which are protists that are believed to be the ancestors for the land plants. They're green algae. Looking over here at the land plants, we can see that the first division includes a distinction between non-vascular, which are plants that do not have xylem and phloem for transporting fluids through the plant, and the vascular plants, which do have xylem and phloem. We then can look at the next level of divisions, and we see that in the non-vascular group there are only seedless plants, plants without seeds, but for vascular we have both seedless and the seeded plants. When we look at different examples in these groups, we see in the non-vascular seedless, we looked last chapter at the liverworts and the mosses, as well as the vascular seedless plants, the ferns. Now in chapter 26, we'll take a deep look into the seeded plants, and the two main groups of those are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So I just mentioned that the major groups of seeded plants are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. These first seeded plants first appeared, the very ancestors to seeded plants first appeared about 400 million years ago, with the gymnosperms evolving 325 million years ago, and the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, the most recently evolved plants, only 125 million years ago. So the gymnosperms, another name for them, are the coned plants, the plants that have cones, and the angiosperms are the plants that have flowers. And here in this picture I have a maple tree, and you may think that a maple tree is not a flowering plant, but in fact it is. There are tiny little flowers that form in the spring and give rise to these winged seed pods that are typical of maple trees. So let's look at some of the important features that were critical to the evolution of seeded plants. So first off, they had to evolve seeds. So what exactly is the benefit to a seed? Well, the seed is the home for the growing plant embryo. So the seed protects and provides food for that growing plant embryo. Also, seeds can allow the embryo to enter a state of dormancy, which means it stops growing but is not dead, and it allows the clock to be stopped. And so this allows for the tiny plant embryo to survive harsh periods before it has to resume growing, which is the definition of germinating. Additionally, later on, there was the development of structures which are called fruits, which encase seeds. So you find seeds inside of fruits, and this really helped with spreading the seeds about because plants are unable to move themselves. So in order to have their offspring be distributed, there was a benefit to having those seeds in fruits because of the coevolution of plants and animals that would eat the fruits, and then the fruits would pass through their digestive system, and the seeds would be deposited in a nice packet of fertilizer. Additionally, we see that there was the evolution of a structure called pollen in plants. Pollen is the male gametophyte, the male portion of the gametophyte part of the alternate generations, and this pollen includes sperm but some other cells, and this allows for the sperm to no longer be dependent on water, so the sperm is preserved inside of the pollen grain. And the last thing that allowed for the evolution of seed plants was the coevolution between plants and animal pollinators. Organisms like bees and other insects, butterflies, and birds, as well as bats, which I didn't include on this slide, allow for the pollen to be transported from one plant to the next. So let's take a look at what exactly a seed is. So a very important part of the seed is the embryo itself. This is the young plant. It's a diploid structure, so it starts out as a zygote and then starts dividing and growing into an embryo. And we see here is one part of the embryo which will become the plant. It has two main regions, the hypocotyl, which is this region down here, which will become the shoot or the portion of the plant above the ground, and the radicle, which is the portion which will become the root or the part below the ground. In addition, there are either one or two structures called cotyledons, and these are going to be very important for transmitting food reserves to support this embryo for as long as it is encased inside the seed. Now, there are other structures called the endosperm, so that's right here, and the endosperm is a food supply for the embryo, and interestingly enough, it is triploid, meaning that the endosperm has 3 copies of every chromosome, so it could never become part or an additional embryo, so it only serves as a food supply. And then encasing the entire seed is a seed coat, so this is a protective cover. So when we look at seeded plants, they produce 2 kinds of gametophytes. Remember, there's gametophytes and sporophytes. Gametophytes are always haploid, always 1N. So the 2 types of gametophytes are the male or the microgametophytes. So these are found within the pollen grains. So inside the pollen grains there are plant sperm, which for most of the time, most plants have no flagella on the sperm. So no ability to move themselves, as well as haploid support cells. So these are the 2 things that we find inside the pollen grain. So these pollen grains cannot move on their own, therefore they have to be dispersed either by wind, blowing them from one plant to the next, or by the use of a pollinator like bees, butterflies, birds, bats. There's no need to move the sperm through water. The other type of gametophyte, haploid, is the female or the megagametophytes. So these develop within a structure called an ovule, and inside the ovule is an egg, one egg, as well as 6 supporting cells inside each ovule, and they are all haploid. Now, once a haploid sperm joins up with this egg, this ovule becomes fertilized, and this will develop into the seed, with that fertilized egg becoming first a zygote, then an embryo. So this ovule is encased within diploid sporophyte tissue in angiosperms, and this is what will become the fruit. When we look at seeded plants, we see that there are 5 different phyla. Remember, that's the plural for phylum, or groupings of seeded plants. Angiosperms and gymnosperms are the 2 major groups. We see that within the gymnosperms there are 4 different phyla. The most recognizable are the Coniferophyta. These are the pines and the spruces, which we commonly see. Remember, they're all cone-bearing plants. Some other phyla in gymnosperms are the Cicadophyta, Cicadophyta, and that's here. They look like palm trees, but palm trees are actually angiosperms, but they look kind of like them. The Cnidophyta, which look kind of like dried up cactus. And lastly, the Ginkgophyta, and that there is only one species that remains in this phylum, and it is the ginkgo tree, which has this unique leaf shape. For the angiosperms, there is only one phylum, and it's the Anthophyta, Anthophyta, and in that there are many different species. So the largest number of species of all plants, land plants, fall into the angiosperm group. We call the angiosperms the flowering plants. We call the gymnosperms the cone-bearing plants. So everybody in angiosperm has to have a flower. So these are very recognizable in some plants, like this flowering dogwood, like this rose, very recognizable. But you may not think about or see the flowers that happen, say, in an oak tree, which does belong to this phylum, or a corn plant. So let's start off with looking at the gymnosperm group. So gymnosperm means plants with naked seeds. There are 4 living groups, Coniferophytes, the Cicadophytes, the Cnidophytes, and the Ginkgophytes. As we mentioned before, these are the 4 different phyla. All of them lack flowers and fruits that the angiosperms have. So none of these have flowers or fruits. They do have an ovule, but the ovule is not encased in a fruit. Rather, it's exposed on a scale or one of the blades of a cone. So here we see in the gymnosperms, we have 2 types of cones. There are female cones and there are male cones. The female cones are found higher up in the plant, and the male cones are found on lower branches. The sporophyte generation, remember, for all of these plants, all these seeded plants, is the dominant generation, the sporophyte. The gametophytes are located inside of these cones, so this is the other generation. So if we take a look at the female cone, the gametophyte is found right here on the blade of the cone, and in it will be the ovule or the egg. The male gametophyte is found in the male cones. So here is one little packet of sperm cells in a pollen grain. Let's look at that phylum that I mentioned, Coniferophyta. These are the conifers. These are the most familiar of all the gymnosperms. They include pines, spruces, firs, cedars, and other trees of that likelihood. We have a few examples of them here, with the coastal redwood being the tallest living vascular plant, and the bristlecone pine being, this is the bristlecone here, being the oldest living tree in the gymnosperm group. When we look at reproduction of the pines, so these are the conifers, the gametophytes are found in the cones. Remember, there's a microgametophyte, that's the pollen grains. The pollen grains are found in the male cones, which are smaller, and they have modified leaves. Within this microgametophyte, you will have the sperm as well as other supporting cells. The female gametophyte, which is found in the female cones, contains the ovule on each of the scales that are found in these cones. And here's a YouTube video that you can go out and take a look at for further explanation. The next phylum are the cycads. So Cicadophyta, these are the ones that I mentioned look like palm trees, But again, they're going to have cones, and they are not palm trees because palm trees actually have flowers. These are very slow-growing gymnosperms found in tropical and subtropical regions, and the cones can be quite large. The gonidophytes, or phylum Gonidophyta, these are the only gymnosperms that have vessels in their xylem, and they fall into three very unusual groupings. Here's one's called the ephedra, the netum, and the welwitschia. So the only one that I'm going to mention is the ephedra because it may sound similar to a term you've heard before, ephedrine, and ephedrine is a very potent decongestant. So Sudafed is something that you can purchase in the pharmacy for treating colds and allergies if you have a lot of congestion. The last group of our gymnosperms are the Ginkgophyta, or the Ginkgophytes, and there's only one remaining species, the Ginkgo biloba, and this is a tree that has these unique fan-shaped leaves. It does have flagellated sperm, so it is the only plant that has flagellated sperm. Most of the plants do not. It's dioecious, meaning it has male and female reproductive structures on different trees. So remember back when we talked about the pines, we had male cones and female cones on the same tree. For the ginkgo, you will have a male tree and a female tree. So their reproductive structures are on totally separate trees. Now let's move on to talking about the angiosperms, which are the most prominent of plants in number and the most successful due to their very efficient reproductive structures, which are the flowers. So the flowers are the reproductive structures of these plants in this group. So let's take a look at flower anatomy. Within most flowers, but not all, you have both male and female reproductive structures. So in this particular flower, we see this green structure, which is called the carpel. That's the name you should remember, the carpel. Within the carpel, you will have an ovule. The ovule will have an egg as well as supporting cells. Then there is a style, which is a stem, and a stigma, which is a sticky top to this whole entire structure. So within some plants, in some flowers, you will have multiple ovules if you're going to produce multiple seeds, or you may have just one ovule if that flower is going to produce only a single seed, say like in an avocado. The stamen is a separate structure. So here's the carpel. The stamen is a separate structure, and in this particular plant we have more than one. The stamen has pollen grains, which are located in a structure called the anther. So the pollen grains, remember, inside each pollen grain is sperm and supporting cells. Inside the anther, we have many pollen grains. And then there is a filament or a supporting structure that holds up the anther. So what happens is that there are both male and female components to this plant. When a pollinator, like a bee, lands on the flower to collect nectar, which is sweetness found in the flower. So the nectar is what the bee is after, the sugar. But in the meantime, it walks around the flower, gets pollen grains all stuck on it, and when it crosses over the stigma, which is the sticky top to the carpel, the pollen gets transferred. Now, a single flower can be self-pollinated, or this bee can then travel to another flower and deliver sperm from one flower to the carpel of another flower. So here's the life cycle for angiosperms. We just took a look at this flower structure. Here's the anther, which releases the pollen grains. When the pollen grain lands on top of the carpel usually by a pollinator, here's the sperm cells. The pollen grain, those supporting cells, will start to grow a tube, and this tube will grow its way all the way down the style of the carpel and right up to the ovule, and it will release into the ovule 2 sperm. Now within the ovule is 1 egg and 6 supporting cells. One of those sperm will fertilize the egg. The other sperm is going to fertilize 2 adjacent cells, and that will become the endosperm. Then this embryo continues its growth and forms a seed. Now, as I mentioned, some ovaries in the carpel will have multiple seeds, and some will have just a single seed. So that carpel, once the ovules are fertilized, the carpel becomes a fruit. So fertilized ovules are the seeds. And the fruits can be either fleshy, like this apple, and we're seeing only 1 seed, but there's multiple seeds in this apple. This was once the carpel of a flower. Additional fleshy fruits are examples are strawberries and oranges. Fruits can also be dry, like rice and nuts, or the dandelion seeds. So here we see this particular seed has a dry little parachute on it, and wind will transport this structure. So therefore, any vegetable with seeds is technically a fruit. So there's always been a big debate about, is a tomato a vegetable or a fruit? It has seeds in it, so therefore it is a fruit. We can next divide the angiosperms into 2 groups called the monocots and the eudicots, or I prefer the term dicots. So mono means 1, di means 2. This has to do with the production of the cotyledons in the seed. So in monocots, we have a single cotyledon in the seed. And remember, the cotyledon is the structure which transfers stored food to the embryo that is in the seed. So monocots only have a single one of these cotyledons. Dicots have 2 cotyledons for transporting to the embryo. We also see that in plants that are monocots, they have very long, narrow leaves, and the leaves have parallel veins, or xylem and phloem. Whereas the dicots have broad leaves that have a network of veins. So they are not all parallel, they go at different angles. When we look at the vascular bundles, so this is the groupings of xylem and phloem, the xylem and phloem is scattered. So here is one grouping of xylem and phloem, here's another, here's another. So if you were to cut through this leaf and look from a side view, because remember the xylem and phloem are all running this way, you would see that they are in different locations. Whereas if you were to cut through the plant tissue in a dicot, you would see that the xylem and phloem bundles are arranged in a ring. Another distinction that we can see is that for monocots, when we look at their flowers, they have flower parts that are in multiples of 3. Here's 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, whereas in the dicots, their flower parts are in multiples of 4s or 5s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Another distinction, monocots do not produce wood. Remember, wood is the lignin structure, and so examples of monocots would be things like grasses and palms. So they are herbaceous or do not produce true wood. Dicots do produce true wood. So this is the secondary growth, what we call the secondary growth. So all plants have primary growth. So this is the growth of the roots and the shoots. Remember the apical meristems, and we call this the pith. And then if the plant is a dicot, it will add rings of secondary growth. Rings of secondary growth. And then it can expand in width, because remember, growth at the apical meristems is only growth in length. Growth in width creates wood. And we have secondary xylem, which are these rings, and then on the very outside we have secondary phloem, which would be where the bark is. So what are some of the benefits of seeded plants? There are many of them. Number one, they are the base of the food web. So if we take a look, the plants are at the very bottom of the food web. The herbivores eat the plants. The carnivores eat the herbivores. So these plants are essential to our food web. Also, these plants are able to cycle carbon through photosynthesis. They're able to transfer carbon dioxide into sugars that can make the body of the plant that form the base of the food web. Additionally, through photosynthesis, and here's a very quick summation of photosynthesis that we talked about from last semester. Remember, we have the light reactions, which capture the energy, and then we have the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle, that convert carbon dioxide into sugars. It's in these light reactions that we are able to break apart water and release oxygen, which is so very important to all of us who are not photosynthesizers and rely on oxygen. Also, that serves as a carbon sink. So we are able through photosynthesis, the plants are able to take carbon dioxide and lock up the carbon portion of carbon dioxide and take it out of the atmosphere. Additionally, plants will stabilize the soil. We see an image over here of the plants growing on a hillside that's keeping the soil from eroding away. Plants can help moderate the climate. When we have plants, they transpire. So transpiration is the release of water, and the release of water is what forms clouds and helps keep our lower atmosphere warm. Also, these clouds and the tree leaves themselves help protect us from the harsh rays of the sun, and help keep the lower levels of the earth from getting too warm. And lastly, plants are very, very important for the production of a lot of products that we use in medicines. So I've just got a few of them here, but they can be herbal plants that can be used as medicines, and they can provide vitamins. We also have a very important plant, the willow tree, which makes salicylic acid, which is otherwise known as aspirin. And there's a whole host of drugs which come from plants. And so that will conclude our chapter 26 on the seeded plants.